It is the winter of 1943, and somewhere in occupied France, a man is walking. He is dressed like a farmer, rough canvas jacket, mud on his boots, a cloth cap pulled low against the cold. He moves without urgency, without the stiff self-consciousness of a man who knows he is being watched. But he is always being watched. In this country, at this hour, everyone is always being watched. Ahead of him, at the junction of two narrow roads that cross between bare winter fields, a German soldier stands beneath a pale electric lamp. He is young, perhaps 19, and he is cold. His breath fogs in the air. He shifts his weight from foot to foot. He is thinking about somewhere warm. He is thinking about home. The farmer passes the checkpoint. Documents are examined. A gloved hand waves him through. The soldier turns back towards the light. What happens next takes less than 2 seconds. There is a sound, not a crack, not a bang, but something closer to the noise a car door makes when it does not quite latch. A soft, mechanical click. The soldier does not cry out. He does not fall dramatically. He simply stops moving, and then he is on the ground, and the farmer is already 50 meters down the road, and in the winter darkness of occupied France, nothing whatsoever appears to have changed. In the soldier's pocket, the papers he checked are still warm. This is the story of the Welrod. It is a story about silence as a weapon, about the engineering of invisibility, and about the peculiar British genius for solving impossible problems with improbable tools. It is a story about a device so effective, so quietly lethal, and so carefully designed that versions of it remained in active service use for more than 60 years after the war that created it. And it begins, as so many strange and brilliant things begin, in a converted country house in the English countryside. To understand why the Welrod existed, you must first understand what the Second World War looked like from the perspective of the people fighting it in the shadows. By 1941, Germany occupied most of Western Europe. France had fallen, the Netherlands had fallen, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, all occupied. Across this vast gray empire, the Germans maintained control not through brute force alone, but through the machinery of administration, checkpoints, curfews, informers, identity papers, patrols. A German soldier on a street corner was not merely a soldier, he was a node in a system, a living part of a network designed to make resistance functionally impossible. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, the organization created by Churchill with the instruction to set Europe ablaze, understood this problem with painful clarity. Their agents were being inserted into occupied territories with forged documents, civilian cover identities, and limited means of protecting themselves. When those cover identities were threatened, when a guard became suspicious, when an informer needed to be silenced, the agents faced an almost impossible dilemma. The weapons available to them were built for conventional warfare. A standard-issue pistol, the Webley, the Browning High Power, the Walther PPK, produced a muzzle blast that on a quiet night could be heard 300 meters away. In an urban environment, in a village near a German garrison, a single shot was a signal flare. It announced not merely that violence had occurred, but precisely where it had occurred, and it gave every nearby soldier approximately 15 seconds to converge on the source. The Hollywood suppressor, the long, elegant tube that reduces a gunshot to a gentle whisper, barely existed outside fiction. The primitive suppressors of the era were bulky, ineffective, and prone to failure. They reduced a gunshot from deafening to merely loud. They were not solutions. They were engineering gestures. What the SOE needed was something categorically different. They needed a weapon that could eliminate a target at close range with essentially no acoustic signature, something that produced noise comparable to the ambient sounds of an occupied town at night. A cough, a footstep, a shutting door. The problem was considered by most conventional weapons designers to be essentially unsolvable. Station 9 was not, from the outside, a particularly remarkable place. Located at the Frythe, a Victorian country house near Welwyn in Hertfordshire, it operated officially as a research facility, and, in a sense, it was. But what it researched was the science of clandestine killing. The engineers and designers who worked there were tasked with producing tools that had no precedent in any military handbook. Weapons for people who were not, technically speaking, soldiers, fighting a war that was not, technically speaking, a war. It was here, in the early months of 1942, that a team of designers led by a man known in the historical record simply as Major Hugh Reeves began work on what would become the Welrod. The name itself was a Station 9 convention, well for Welwyn, rod for the cylindrical shape of the finished device. It was, in its completed form, one of the most ingeniously simple firearms ever produced. The Welrod was, at its core, a bolt-action single-shot pistol built around an integrated suppressor. And the word integrated is crucial here because it was the integration that made it work. Most suppressors of the era were add-on attachments. You built a gun, and then you bolted a suppressor to the front of the barrel after the fact. The problem with this approach is that a firearm produces noise from multiple sources simultaneously. The muzzle blast as expanding propellant gas escapes the barrel, the mechanical action of the slide or bolt cycling, and sometimes the supersonic crack of the bullet itself if it is traveling faster than the speed of sound. An external suppressor addresses only the first of these problems. The others persist. Reeves and his team addressed this by reconceiving the entire weapon from first principles. The Welrod's barrel was fully enclosed within a suppressor tube approximately 30 centimeters long and roughly 3 centimeters in diameter, about the size of a large torch. The suppressor itself was divided into a series of internal baffles, chambers through which the expanding propellant gas was forced to pass before it could escape, losing pressure and velocity at each stage. By the time the gas reached the open air, it had been so thoroughly dispersed that it produced almost no discernible sound. The action was a simple turn bolt. The shooter rotated a knob at the rear of the weapon to unlock the bolt, drew it back to eject the spent cartridge and cock the firing mechanism, then pushed it forward to chamber a fresh round. There was no semi-automatic action, no spring-loaded slide, no mechanical cycling. The bolt was operated manually, by hand, which meant the only moving parts during the firing sequence itself were those absolutely necessary to fire the weapon. The mechanical signature was, accordingly, minimal. The pistol grip contained a single-column magazine holding between 6 and 8 rounds depending on the caliber variant, and the grip was designed to be detached and used as a handle during firing. In practice, this meant the entire weapon could be concealed inside a coat sleeve or beneath a newspaper, and the shooter's hand, wrapped around the grip, looked from a distance simply like someone holding a rolled umbrella. 2 caliber variants were produced. The primary version chambered the .32 ACP cartridge, a relatively low-powered round that had the significant advantage of being subsonic at standard loads, meaning the bullet itself produced no supersonic crack. A second variant, produced in smaller numbers, chambered the 9mm Parabellum, though this version required the use of specially loaded subsonic ammunition to achieve the same acoustic performance. The Welrod was manufactured at Birmingham Small Arms, with components produced at various facilities across the Midlands. Exact production figures remain classified or lost, but estimates drawn from surviving SOE procurement records suggest that somewhere between 2,500 and 14,000 units were produced across the war, the extraordinary range in that estimate reflecting the deliberate opacity with which SOE procurement was conducted. These were weapons whose very existence was deniable, and the paperwork surrounding them was treated accordingly. The Welrod entered operational service in 1943, issued first to SOE agents operating in France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. Its operational history exists in fragments, individual after-action reports, post-war testimonies, the memories of agents who survived, because the nature of clandestine warfare is that its most effective moments go unrecorded. What the records do confirm is that the weapon was used for targeted killings of German personnel, for the elimination of local informers and collaborators, and for the silencing of guard dogs, a use for which it proved unexpectedly practical, the low report being insufficient to alert nearby soldiers to anything unusual. In Denmark, members of the Danish resistance received Welrods as part of SOE supply drops and used them to conduct a series of targeted assassinations of Danish informers who were providing the Gestapo with intelligence about resistance networks. The operations were, by the accounts that survive, surgically precise. An informer could be eliminated on a crowded street, and by the time the body was discovered, the shooter was 3 streets away and the weapon was disassembled in a coat pocket. In the Netherlands, resistance fighters reported that the weapon's most psychologically powerful effect was not the deaths it caused directly, but the uncertainty it created among German garrison troops. When soldiers began dying, a sentry found slumped at his post a patrol member who simply failed to return, without any sound having been heard, without any witness, without any apparent mechanism. The effect on German garrison morale was reportedly significant. Troops became reluctant to stand alone. Checkpoint duties, normally considered routine, became sources of genuine anxiety. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The exact number of individuals killed with Welrods during the Second World War is not known. It is possibly in the hundreds. It may be significantly more. The nature of the weapon's deployment, clandestine, unofficial, often by non-uniformed combatants operating under cover, means that many uses were never reported, and many of those that were reported exist only in files that remain restricted. What can be said is that the accounts which do survive consistently describe a weapon that performed, in operational conditions, exactly as its designers at Station 9 had intended. The Germans, for their part, were not without suppressed weapons of their own. The Wehrmacht and the SS had access to several suppressed firearms throughout the war, the most notable of which was the Schalldämpfer-equipped MP-40 Ears, a suppressed variant of the standard submachine gun. The Gestapo also made use of suppressed pistols, most commonly the Walther PPK fitted with a commercial suppressor. German engineers were competent, and German manufacturing was formidable. But the German approach to suppression was fundamentally different from the British one, and that difference reflected a fundamental difference in doctrine. German suppressed weapons were designed for conventional military use, for commando operations, for small unit infiltration, for reducing noise in tactical engagements. They were, in essence, ordinary firearms made quieter. The suppression was an addition, not a foundation. The Welrod was built around its suppression from the very beginning. Every design choice, the bolt action, the subsonic caliber, the integrated baffle system, the manual operation, was made in service of a single priority: silence. The weapon was not made quiet. It was built quiet. The Americans who developed their own suppressed weapons through the OSSE, the Office of Strategic Services, the American equivalent of the SOEE, produced the high-standard HDM, a suppressed pistol that achieved respectable results in testing but proved mechanically more complex and less field-reliable than the Welrod. The HDM was a semi-automatic pistol with a removable suppressor, which meant it retained the mechanical cycling noise that the Welrod's bolt action eliminated entirely. It was, by most accounts from agents who had used both, a noisier weapon. The Soviets, meanwhile, developed their own tradition of suppressed firearms that would eventually produce the remarkable PB pistol in the 1960s. But Soviet suppressed weapons in the 1940s were crude by comparison, and Soviet clandestine doctrine placed less emphasis on the kind of individual targeted elimination at which the Welrod excelled. In comparative terms, the Welrod was arguably the most acoustically effective close-range silent weapon produced by any combatant nation during the Second World War. This is not a claim that can be made with absolute certainty. Comparative testing at the time was not conducted under controlled conditions, and the accounts that survive are anecdotal. But the engineering principles underlying the Welrod's design were sufficiently sound that they influenced every serious effort to build a suppressed pistol for the remainder of the 20th century. The historical impact of the Welrod sights, as it was designed to, mostly in the shadows. There are no battles won directly attributable to it. There are no major operations whose success hinges demonstrably on its use. What it offered was not the power to change the course of large events, but the power to alter the texture of small ones, to remove a guard without raising an alarm, to silence an informer without triggering a search, to create in the minds of occupying forces a persistent, low-level fear that seemed to arrive from nowhere and could not be countered by any standard military response. In this sense, its impact was primarily psychological. The weapon worked not only by killing but by threatening, and the threat did not even need to be explicitly communicated. The simple fact that soldiers were dying without apparent cause, without shots being heard, without struggles being witnessed, was itself a form of information, and it was information that eroded, incrementally, the confidence of an occupying power that depended on appearing invincible. Its technical legacy is more easily traced. The Welrod's integrated suppressor design, the principle that the suppressor should be conceived as part of the weapon rather than in addition to it, became the foundational approach for all serious suppressed firearm development in the post-war period. The Delisle carbine, produced concurrently in Britain, applied the same principle to a longer-range weapon. Later, British suppressed weapons, including several still in classified service, owe a clear design debt to the thinking developed at Station 9. The Welrod remained in active service in various forms and with various modifications with British Special Forces and intelligence services until at least the 1990s, and there are credible accounts unconfirmed, naturally, KC, of its use in conflicts as recent as the Falklands War in 1982. The weapon was procured for use during the Gulf War. It has been described, by those who have used it, as functionally irreplaceable for the specific operational role it was designed to fill. Several original Welrods survive in museum collections. The Imperial War Museum in London holds examples, as does the Royal Armouries in Leeds. They look in a display case entirely innocuous. Dull metal cylinders, slightly longer than a hand, resembling nothing so much as a bicycle pump or a length of plumbing pipe. It is difficult, looking at them, to understand what they are. That invisibility, that absolute refusal to look like what they are, was always the point. Return for a moment to that junction in occupied France. The winter of 1943, the lamp, the young soldier, the farmer with mud on his boots. What happened at that checkpoint? What the records that survive suggest happened at checkpoints like it, across occupied Europe, throughout the war, was not the product of heroism alone. It was the product of engineering, of careful, deliberate, unglamorous thought conducted in a country house in Hertfordshire by men whose names do not appear in the histories of famous battles. The Welrod did not win the war. Nothing so small and quiet could win a war, but it did something that matters differently. It made occupation dangerous for the occupiers. It told the soldiers who manned those checkpoints on a cold night under a pale lamp that the darkness was not neutral, that the people walking past them were not helpless, that silence was not safety. The German army, which swept across Europe with armored columns and dive bombers and the most sophisticated military machine the world had yet produced, was not defeated by anything comparable in scale or spectacle. It was defeated, in part, by 10,000 small things: a bridge destroyed, a train derailed, a coded message intercepted, a guard who did not complete his shift. The Welrod was one of those small things. It weighed approximately 1.1 kilograms. It measured 32 centimeters in length. It held 6 rounds and cost the British government approximately £4 to manufacture. It made a sound like a door closing softly in another room. And in occupied Europe, In the long dark years before the liberation, it meant that no soldier standing alone beneath a lamp at a country crossroads could ever be entirely certain that the next person who walked past was simply a farmer going home. Silence, it turns out, is its own kind of power, and the British, in the winter of 1942, learned to manufacture it.